Broadly speaking, Book 2 is a digression. Plot-wise, here's what you need to know. Back in Book 1, before Cyrus's death, he had dreamt that Darius, the son of a Persian noble, would inherit his kingdom. He had interpreted this to mean that Darius was plotting against him, but it was not so, and he did not live long enough to investigate the matter further. At the start of Book 2, then, control of the empire goes to Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. Cambyses gathered an army composed of many of the peoples Cyrus had conquered, including Ionian and Aeolian Greeks, which he considered to be slaves inherited from his father, and launched a military expedition against Egypt. At the time Cambyses invaded, the king of Egypt was named Amasis, and his son was Psammenitus. Amasis had taken Egypt over during a revolt against the previous king, Apries. Herodotus then brings the narrative to a halt for quite some time to explain who the Egyptians are, their outlook on the world, their history, geography, gods, and cultural practices. Since it is a departure from the narrative, this video will mostly be interpretation and analysis. We learn a lot about the Egyptians that helps provide us needed context later in the story. The ancient Egyptians were an extremely religious people. They held many animals to be sacred, and as we'll see, some animals were believed to be gods, usually cows. Killing a sacred animal could be punishable by death. They were also a very well-learned people whose doctors were known for specializing in particular illnesses. We also learn about a nation of Ethiopians living somewhere to the south of Egypt, across the desert. They were long-lived, tall, and very strong, though rarely interested in conquest. Except for when they were. Once, for a period of 50 years, the Ethiopians took over Egypt before departing of their own volition, allowing the rightful Egyptian king to reassume the throne. They'll come back later in the story. Herodotus, in the words of Dewald, is fascinated by the interplay of nature and culture. You can most easily see this throughout the histories and how different peoples or even individuals interact with water. Rivers and water in general are, for Herodotus, natural boundaries, and dire things happen to those who heedlessly transgress them. Also in Book 2, Herodotus tells us that he believes that the ocean river is entirely made up, as he has found no evidence for its existence. Call from Homer that the ocean river was thought, in Greek mythology, to encircle the world, or at least the Greek world, and beyond its bounds lay the immortal realms, such as Hades, the land of the dead. Despite the fact that it has no physical existence, it appears as though Herodotus has the symbolic significance of this river well integrated into his worldview. To him, water remains an uncrossable boundary. So, be on the lookout for peoples or leaders who cross waters, boundaries that is, that perhaps they shouldn't. Kingship for the Egyptians was arguably different than that of both Persia and Greece. Herodotus gives us examples of Egyptian kings being cruel to their subjects, most often through forced labor in building the pyramids or digging enormous canals, but this is interspersed with kings that try to turn around that precedent and be kind to their people. At the end of Book 2, the general populace defected to a rebel king on account of the mistreatment of an eminent Egyptian by their current king. I infer from this that the Egyptians did not think of their king's will as infallible. They have some conception that they have human dignity, or at least some of them have human dignity that should not be transgressed, even by the king. That's different from Persia. Herodotus tells us that both the warrior and priestly classes enjoyed special privileges in Egyptian society. All of this to say that not all of the citizens of Egypt were considered mere slaves of the king. Kingship was not as absolute and totalitarian as it was in Persia, but the common people that didn't belong to a higher class could still be forced into labor. Kingship was something that they still regarded as necessary. They hadn't thrown it out in favor of democracy. So the question is, how will the Egyptians react or respond once they come into contact with Persia? Or what about the Greeks? I guess we'll see. We also get a good deal of information that is not important for this great book, but will come back later, further down the timeline. That is, these ideas will be discussed in other works by other authors, perhaps centuries later, so they're still important. The Egyptians in Herodotus worship most of the same gods as Greece, Herodotus says, though usually with different names, appearances, and even differing accounts of their stories. This was something that I got to ask Carolyn Dewald about. I wondered why Herodotus would presume that all of the gods worshipped by each of the cultures were the same, even though so much about them was different. We know today that the Persians didn't worship Zeus, they practiced Zoroastrianism. Same for the Egyptians, whose pantheon and religion were obviously different from that of the Greeks, who worshipped the Olympian gods. Dewald responded that for Herodotus, and perhaps others in the ancient world, each god in their system was a manifestation of power. The power of fertility, lightning, oceans, nature, etc. Thus, when Herodotus identifies the same powers, he infers that it must be the same god being worshipped. He goes on to report that Greece got their pantheon from the Egyptians, and lastly, he believes that everyone is equal in terms of religious knowledge. I do not see any point in relating anything I was told about the gods except their names alone. This tells me that at this point in time there was no theology. That is, there is no disciplined, intellectual, rigorous study of the gods and their nature. Or, perhaps, Herodotus is simply not going there right now. Herodotus comments that the Egyptians were the first to believe in the immortality of the soul, however, an idea that takes until Plato to arrive in Greece. There's definitely enough potential for a discussion about these topics within Herodotus' world, but it seems that nobody's really having it yet. Despite living with their animals, the Egyptians make clear distinctions between gods, humans, and animals. For them, it is impossible that a human could descend from a god, and it is also unlawful for humans to behave in a sanctuary as an animal would. Herodotus says that we may draw upon the familiar to understand the unknown. This quote could mean a few different things, but here are the meanings for this that appear elsewhere in Herodotus' writing that I could find. There is an order, a logic to nature and the world as a whole, and transgressing that order has natural consequences. We may try to understand a thing by seeing how it is similar or different to categories we may already know. Conceptually putting things in boxes, at least to start, can be very helpful. Lastly, Herodotus thinks critically about Homer's work based on discoveries he makes in his travels. The Egyptian priests claim that Paris, again called Alexander, had been forced by rough winds into Egypt on his way back to Troy from Sparta. The Egyptian king discovered what Paris had done, arrested him, took Helen and her valuables in trust for Menelaus whenever he came looking for her, and banished Paris from his land. Menelaus and the Greeks then went to Troy looking for Helen, only to be told by the Trojans that she was in Egypt. They didn't believe them, though, and burned the city to the ground, only to discover later that they were telling the truth. Menelaus then went to Egypt to fetch Helen and her treasures, which in the Odyssey is still recorded, but it's recorded as a diversion caused by a storm. The Athenian Cultural Revolution involved lots of this kind of critical thinking, of analyzing and testing ideas that were taken for granted for generations, such as the events of the Trojan War, all in the service of seeking the truth. That's it for Book 2, though. Please join me next week for Book 3, where Herodotus continues the Persian narrative.